Welcome to the Veterans Hour, a local production of Veterans for Peace, Chapter 109 in Olympia, Washington. Our program shows on Channel 22 in Thurston County on Tuesdays at 5 and Fridays at 8 p.m. We have a very special opportunity tonight to have three people who in their right mind went to a war-torn country. And I want to welcome to my left, Larry Kerschner, who, as I mentioned, is a member of Fellowship of Reconciliation, Veterans for Peace, and who knows how many other things, but also accompanied and was trained by Friendly Water for the World to build biosand water filters. So, Larry, welcome.
Thank you.
And next to Larry is Jody Mackey. Jody Mackey also has multiple membership credentials, and so Jody also, you might see her if you're in the Olympia area at Traditions Cafe and Folk Art. Welcome, Jody.
Thank you.
And next to Jody is the love of her life, Douglas Mackey. And Douglas Mackey is also a part of Veterans for Peace as an associate member and part of Fellowship of Reconciliation, and also was recently trained by the Friendly Water for the World in how to build biosand water filters. Welcome, Douglas.
Thank you very much.
In our introduction, I says, what would people do to go to a war-torn country if they weren't in the service? We know that people do get to go to Afghanistan, and many times not too willingly, but all three of you willingly go or went as volunteers, and what on earth for? And I'm just going to make this a rather informal thing. So,
there's one group that you haven't mentioned yet that we're all participants with, and that's the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers.
yes.
Our friends in Afghanistan that invited us to come over, extending their wish that we be closer friends by coming and getting to know them in their country. So that's one of the reasons that we went over.
So Afghanistan it's one of the worst places to be a child. It's one of the worst places to be a mom with a child. And here are these amazing kids in the middle of Afghanistan working for peace. So you don't get more unseen than to be a child in Afghanistan. So imagine having foreigners from America come to see you. So that's part of what we got to do.
That was part of what drew you. Yeah, Larry?
Yeah, one of the things that we became aware of was the fact that diseases which are related to dirty water is the leading cause of death, despite the fact that it's a war zone. It's diseases of unclean water that's killing the children.
So if war doesn't get you, the unclean water will.
In fact, the unclean water is more likely to get you. 1 out of 4 child born in Afghanistan doesn't live to be 5 years old because of that situation.
1 out of 4.
Yeah. So it's a significant problem. And Doug and I talked about what we could. We talked about going and meeting with the Afghan Youth Peace Group, but we also wanted to go and do something that would be useful. And Doug might tell you about how we came to the idea of doing something related to water.
The local group, Olympia-based Friendly Water for the World, is part of a larger network of, several hundred efforts that use a biosand filter designed by a Canadian who hails out of Calgary. And the organization in Calgary has a network with these several hundred organizations, and so we asked through Friendly Water for the World of the Canada group CAWST, C-A-W-S-T, Center for Affordable Water, ST.
Something.
Scientific technology, perhaps, but it's, and that organization, sustainable technology,
That's
and
probably,
they put us in touch with a Danish group the Denmark Committee for Aid to Afghan Refugees. And in working with them, we were able to connect with trainers and with fabricators for the molds that make it possible to build these filters. So it was a very wise move to to work with them in Dakar, a non-governmental or an NGO, non-governmental organization based in Kabul. In fact, Jody can speak to why you do this so eloquently. Why one of the other reasons it was important to be networked with Dakar.
Oh. Yeah. Well, the road situations have gotten really bad there. It's incredibly dangerous to travel on the roads between cities. For we've all known that the way to Kandahar has been really dangerous. But what's happened is the American military pays millions and millions of dollars to the bad guys in Afghanistan for safe passage for our military, which seems like a really good idea. But to continue to receiving that money, they need to make the roads really dangerous. And so our military and other NGOs and organizations that have a lot of money can pay for safe passage in the roads. So instead, the Talibs and the Mujahideen, they keep the roads dangerous by kidnapping ordinary people. So we were with the youth from Afghanistan, and they couldn't go on the flights with us between Kabul and Bamiyan because only NGO people can go on those flights. Because we were with Dakar, we could take those flights. But Abdullah won't go to Kabul right now because he can't take those flights. At one time last spring, he was taken off a bus and he could have been kidnapped at that time, and it's just put the fear into them.
So individuals cannot travel, is what you're saying, from Kabul. They can all fly in internationally into Kabul.
Yes.
But to get anywhere within the country of Afghanistan, it's virtually impossible unless you're tied to a recognized NGO.
If we hadn't been associated with Dakar, we couldn't have taken one of the flights.
Well, we could have gone on the roads, but 2 days before we got there, 2 German aid workers had tried to go from Kabul to Bamiyan, the road that we would have had to take, and they were killed just a couple of days ahead of us.
Last July, we called the boys. We just happened to call them on this Wednesday. And they were reeling because 2 days before they had been on the road between Kabul and Bamiyan, and there'd been a kidnapping in front of them. So then the morning that we talked to them, that man's tortured body had been delivered to the police. And they knew there would never be any evaluation and no study, no research into who had done that and how it had happened. And part of that reason is 2 years ago, Karzai got together to talk about restorative justice. And instead of doing restorative justice, he came out with a complete amnesty law for all past and future war crimes. So even though we could call this a war crime, no one will ever look into it.
Let me get this straight, because you said future war
Yes.
crimes, not just the past war crimes that we think about,
Right.
but future war crimes.
Future war crimes. And the United States had a response. They said they were concerned. That was their whole response. And so when we visited Bamiyan, we found out who that man was who was kidnapped in front of them. His name is Jawad, and he was the leader of the provincial council in Bamiyan. And he'd been a pretty forward-thinking provincial council leader. See, many years ago, Laura Bush visited Bamiyan, and there's a main street that goes through Bamiyan that was a mud road. And she said, we'll get Bamiyan paved. So millions of dollars poured in, which promptly filtered away, disappeared. Jawad wanted this to happen. He wanted the road to happen, so he worked on it. And then 2 years ago, he filled a dump truck full of mud, and he paved this road with mud, saying, where's the money? This needs to happen. So he did antics like that. he's the man who was picked up in front of the boys on the road, and he's the man who was dismembered and dropped off at the police
Jody, you
station.
mentioned that you've talked with the boys in Bamiyan.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if between you and Douglas, if you would share a little bit about what do you mean talk to them? How do you go about doing this and bring into the international days of listening and the global days, et cetera? Because some of us, many, all of us here tonight, have had the privilege of being able to talk to the boys and get to know them as well. How did this all come about, first of all?
It's worth mentioning that it was prompted by them at a website called OurJourneyToSmile.com. They had created a library of short videos that explained what life was like in Afghanistan. They're led by a group, by a gentleman who is a doctor. Originally, he was born in Singapore, and then as a young man, 32 years old or so, he went to Pakistan and worked in the refugee camps where he met the Afghan refugees and began to get to know their culture and to get to know them. 2 years later, he moved to Afghanistan, where he really lived with them and grew to love the Afghan people. You can certainly understand why when you go over and visit and spend time with them. And as he lived his life as a physician with them, he realized that there was maybe a higher calling for him than being a doctor. I mean, he's sort of an Albert Schweitzer kind of guy, just, in with the poorest of the poor, helping in every way he could, saving, no doubt, saving many lives. And yet there's something more important than just the medical care that he saw that they needed, was an opportunity to work for a peaceful solution, a non-military solution. And he realizes that the Afghan people need to be the ones that create that. And so he helped these youth in particular come together so that they could heal some of the wounds, some of the hard things that they've been through, and then reach out to the other Afghans. It's a multi-ethnic country, and a lot of the challenges that they face moving forward is to resolve some of these ethnic challenges. And then, as a means of doing that, they extend their invitation to the world to listen and talk with them. And so we began to call them back.
And how do you call them back? What do you use?
We use Skype. Usually we use Skype. Occasionally we just call with cell phones, but that gets pretty expensive. So, and we do that with your help, Larry, or Dennis. We do that quarterly for 24 hours a day, and then monthly for a shorter period of time, 4 or 5 months. And then whenever a school group or another nonprofit wants to talk to them, we bring them on.
So who are all these people that talk to them? Douglas, you've been good at getting a lot of interesting people to talk.
It's evolved considerably. As you mentioned, there was the 24-hour phone calls. They started on the International Day of Peace last year in 2010. And again, it was their idea. Well, let's just talk as long as we can with as many people as we can. And by then we had a number of other peace groups had discovered the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers. Voices for Creative Nonviolence was just beginning to recognize them. The September 11 Families for Peaceful Tomorrows had been in many conversations with them. And we had helped to nurture some of these conversations. Veterans for Peace, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and the list then went on from those groups. For instance, the Fellowship of Reconciliation is connected with 22, interfaith peace fellowships, and several of those peace fellowships have taken an active role over the years. And then they have somebody else, a school, that they get involved in, and then that school tells someone else. And so there are now several thousand people who have been part of the days of listening. From that initial one in September of 2010, September 21st, at the end of that call, the boys, as they're affectionately called, there are a number of girls involved, and so sometimes that's unfair to say it that way. But even the girls call them the boys of the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers. They suggested, well, why don't we do this every month? Frankly, we were a little tired at the time, and so we suggested that every 3 months. It was September 21st, that's an equinox, so we'll do it on the solstice and the equinox. Well, a year later, we're now doing it every month on the 21st, and with the emergence of these Occupy efforts around the world, they're inviting the Occupy communities to communicate, and so should any of your viewers be involved with Occupy Olympia or Occupy Wall Street or elsewhere, they're invited to talk with them. And so this is a new chapter in the conversations.
So would you tell our viewing audience then, Douglas, how do we get involved on this? Because it sounds like a pretty exciting thing. I've participated myself since, I've had some of the equipment at home, but how would our viewing audience know about that to become part of a listening audience, a sharing audience?
I think the easy answer to that is to send an email to globaldaysoflistening@gmail.com. Although, and I think Hakeem will forgive me for this, but many people do make contact with them directly through our journeytosmile.com. There are several email addresses you'll find at their website that give you another method to get in touch by email, and then Hakeem will suggest a good way for you to get in touch with them by phone, and frequently that's through Global Days.
Okay. Larry, I notice you've talked to them before. You've even read a poem or two to them, have you not?
Yeah, I learned about them through Doug and Jody, and probably 3 months after it originally started, and talked to them and got to be friends with them, and they inspired me to write a number of poems, and they also inspired the idea of going to visit them and meeting them in person. That was the genesis of how our trip started.
But I know that you have a value system, that you didn't want to go just as an eco-tourist or whatnot. So what did you do about that?
Well, like I say, we talked about a number of issues and came up with the water as a focus. Back in the summer of 2000, I went to Iraq with Kathy Kelly and Voices in the Wilderness, and a number of things stand out, but one of the things that stand out about that trip was we were in the hospital in Basra, and the doctor in the hospital warned us not to drink the water out of the water fountain in the hallway.
In the hospital?
In the hospital, because it would make us sick. And at that time, because of the U.S. sanctions against the people of Iraq, 5,000 children were dying every month, and most of them were dying because of dirty water. So that's when I originally became interested in the relationship between health of children and water. And then when I discovered the situation in Afghanistan, where depending on which statistic you read, somewhere between 75 and 90% of the households don't have clean water. And then the children are dying, the mortality, or the age of mortality is decreasing. I think it's down to 40 years now in Afghanistan. And it's just it sounded like a terrible situation. So Doug had taken the training Friendly Waters to the World, and I had learned a little bit about it a year previous when I was planning on a trip to India, because they're doing some of the same things in India. And so I got, there was some training in the Olympia area last June on how to make these filters. So I took the training, became certified, and then we decided that we would go and make that a focus of the trip.
Now, you are a retired health professional. What type of waterborne diseases are things that people are looking at that could be very lethal?
Well, there's any number of them, dysentery, typhoid, basically all of them cause diarrhea. And usually through diarrhea, you become dehydrated, you lose electrolytes, which can affect the electrical system of the body and, you know, die. I mean, diarrhea sounds simple, but it can be a fatal disease if you don't have the support system available to deal with it properly. So it's
a preventable.
Extremely preventable. That was what struck me in Iraq. All these children were dying from diseases that would be easily treated were the medication available or were even just clean water available. That's the treatment for most of these diseases, is clean water.
Now, Douglas, I know that this whole area of clean water really captivated you over a year ago when you took the training. And people have gone out to Haiti, they've been to India, Kenya, Burundi, and now the three of you have been to Afghanistan. What was it that captured your heart, your imagination, that water could be something that would make such a difference?
Well, there's little that's as basic as water in our lives, for all of life. My background's as a scientist and worked in environmental sciences my whole life, and so yeah, water's pretty basic. It's necessary for all life, and then to see how close so many people are to having clean water, and you know, a lot of it's education. And one of the things you learn when you go through the training is that the creation of the clean water through this biosand water filter is one issue, but beyond that is the issue of sanitation that increases the need for clean water, because our practices as human beings include needing good sanitary facilities and good personal hygiene. And so the availability of the clean water is one issue, but an issue that's even more important is to be able to have sanitary systems. And then even more important than that is to have the hygiene practices and the knowledge. And so, yeah, it was when you get there, when we met with folks in Dakar, they echoed the same issue, that getting the clean water systems was one part of it, but helping people learn that how important it is. I mean, the water, having dirty water gives you, that we all discovered this in some way, shape, or form while we were there, that you can get the organisms in you pretty easily. Just forget to wash your grapes and you'll be sorry in a
Brush
day or
your
two.
teeth with water that's not
Yes.
clean.
Right. It's pretty easy, even if you have clean bottled water around. And we also know how to, because of the way we're brought up and where we live, how to treat it pretty quickly and move on. But it doesn't happen that way over there. And so there's a huge need to help folks teach themselves and teach their own families. We have to be careful when we talk about helping others, because we want to assist them in assisting themselves. And there's a crying need for hygiene education and for sanitary systems.
Well, as a matter of fact, Douglas, the training that Larry went through had a number of people from the new country of South Sudan, and they are going back very soon. They're teaching compostable toilets for them, as well as the biosand water filters. And then one of the people that was at the training is back in Burundi building the biosand water filters. He's constructed 3,100 homes, but they don't have the water.
Yes.
And so now Friendly Water for the World, which is a 501c3 organization right here in Olympia, Washington, is helping to provide the molds so that, that he can actually do that. Take us to the moment that you all decided you were going to make this trip. And from there, walk us through some of the things that happened and what stuck out.
I remember talking to Larry at the second Global Days of Listening, I think, across from Traditions, as I decided inside that I was going to go sometime, I don't know, the next 6 months or something, it may have been. But I wasn't clear. I wasn't 100% clear on how or why or exactly when. And so I think both Larry and I wanted to make sure we weren't going over as political tourists. I guess when you're visiting the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers in earnest as their friends, that should be reason enough. That should be just fine. That would be my read on it, because friendship and caring about each other is one of the reasons we have these wars that continue, because people do not know each other. If, for instance, we are able to continue to grow the conversations to the point where every 20-year-old in the U.S. had been exposed to the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers and their friends and the other Afghans that are 20 years old, I don't think there would be these kinds of violent solutions to the problems. So that in and of itself was the big reason that came out of our conversations. But then when Larry said that he would, yeah, I'd be interested in thinking about it. And some time went by. I don't know, Larry, what were your thoughts?
Well, I don't know, a week or so, discussed it with my wife, and it just seemed like the thing to do, especially when we heard that there was going to be the training available for the biosand water filters. That kind of sealed it that we would do it. And then we talked about it, and the September 21st is the International Day of Peace.
Yes.
And we also thought it would be kind of unique to be on the other end of the phone for the Global Day of Listening.
And so you were.
And we were, and it was definitely unique.
Now, I had the opportunity of establishing some of the communications here in Olympia, knowing that 3 of my friends were at the other end. Would you describe for our viewing audience what it's like to be on this global day, but at the other end, not here where we have computers and other type of things that we can participate? You were there watching and listening what was happening.
Maybe there's a segue that could include Jody's reason for going to Afghanistan.
Oh, absolutely.
I found out one day from Jody, and I wasn't aware that Jody was going.
I just said I was, because I was already in love with the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers. We haven't talked very much about them yet. There's Abdullah. So here's Hakeem. He's a medical doctor in Bamiyan. He's trying to figure out how to live in this dangerous place. And after a year, he gets pretty somber. And Abdullah walks up to him and says, "Oh, he's 9 years old, Abdullah. I liked you before last year." "Why is that?" "Oh, because you would smile." And they made this pact together, our journey to smile, that's what they would do together. They would learn how to be happy together, and it's brought this amazing youth group. And the youth group is composed of people from different ethnic groups who have been in civil war together in less than 20 years ago. And they have found the humanity with each other and are reaching out to the rest of the world. Douglas and I got involved 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, when they started a vigil in the snow at the end of October. And they were vigiling so that our president, who was the 2009 Nobel Peace Prize winner, would recognize their desire for peace. They didn't say troops had to go. They didn't say point a finger at anyone as being wrong. They just wanted peace from here on, and they wanted the president to hear that. And they were vigiling in the snow in a tent on the peace park that they had created in Bamiyan, so that, and they were going to vigil until the president recognized that. Well, Douglas heard about this just 2 days before it started, and a couple of hours before that, before they began, which was midnight our time, he said, I've got to do it. And he went down to Percival Landing, and he stood there and created signs in the rain, and it rained on us just about the whole week until the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan came to visit with them and told them that he would bring their missive to Obama. We stood in the rain and snow. I was usually the night shift.
And I remember that time because the Coreys of the Rachel Corey Foundation drove by and saw you vigiling out in this miserable weather, and brought a very significant thing which has a special meaning to the Afghans, and that was tea.
Yes, they brought us a pot of tea, and we began to serve tea to the people who came by, because there's in that part of Afghanistan, the saying is the first cup of tea were strangers and the second cup friends. And so we worked on becoming friends with everyone we met. So that was just a little story about Abdullah. But there are many stories about what each of these Faiz and Muhammad Jan, how they have worked in their communities to bring peace, what they're up to, and how they connect with people in other war-torn countries. In this amazing way, people in Palestine who say lost a friend the day before, or people in Rwanda, or people in Iraq. The last phone call, when we were in this little hotel room with no power, there's only 4 hours of power there. That's part of what we didn't understand. Here we are, Larry, Douglas, and I, we've been on the American side of the calls all this time. Well, in Afghanistan, they have 4 hours of power. They're working on a little cell phone, hoping for connection with the rest of the world. So we start out again on the couches, which are just little pillows around the outside of the room. And then the call starts, and as soon as the question comes up, the boys scooch into the center close to the phone, and Hakeem does the translation so that they can understand. And his response is completely what the boys are saying. It's not this educated man's response. It's the cry for peace from the boys in Afghanistan. And it is usually boys. The women are very constrained in Afghanistan, and the girls. And this is going for 24 hours. They can't be in a room with these girls for 24 hours. And so for these calls, it's all boys. There's the occasional time when we can reach the girls on the call, but for the long calls, it's not going to happen.
Well, in our viewing audience, we'll see a picture of a candle. Tell us about that candle.
Yes. 24 hours of calls, 4 hours of power. You wouldn't spend a lot of time in the dark except for the candles that we lit and spread around the room.
And then another picture we see is Hakeem holding up a cell phone and talking to the cell phone, having a speakerphone on it so that people can hear.
Yes.
One of the things that we noticed or learned when we were there, before we went, we had heard wisdom from these boys through Hakeem, and it's easy to think that an adult mentor would come and would teach these boys how to live and teach them, because they kind of follow Gandhian principles. But when we were there and we actually saw the way they worked with each other, is a question would come in, Hakeem would translate it. We called him our universal translator because he knew so many languages. But he would translate it, and then you would watch. There would be a response from Faiz, a response from Nurulai, a response from Abdullah, and then they would talk it over, and then Hakeem would ask a question to clarify something, and then there'd be more response. And then Hakeem would give the response, translated in English from each of the boys. And you could tell that the wisdom was coming out of these children who've grown up in a situation where they've only known war. And somehow they've developed these large hearts that see that peace is the answer, the only answer to living in a situation as dire as Afghanistan is.
So Hakeem is not only a physician, but he is a true educator that draws out rather than pours in.
I almost hesitate to use the word educator because that kind of suggests that he's educating
Well, that's
them.
why I use the term draw out.
Right,
Yeah.
but and in fact, the boys are the educators. Hakeem has learned what
Good point.
from the boys. They're the ones, they're the teachers in the situation. So that was something we were able to see in person that maybe we wouldn't have recognized had we not gone there.
I think that while we didn't hear the voice of women, and we don't hear it very much here over the internet or the telephone calls, the voice of women is incorporated in the voice of the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers, and that one of the reasons that we were very glad that Jody did go along is that we were able to connect with the culture of women in Afghanistan in ways that, I mean, you know,
You guys
over
couldn't
half,
do it.
Oh, right, yeah, over half of the population.
So
considerably.
what did Jody learn about the whole area of women in Afghanistan?
Oh,
That's a broad question, Jody, so that, you know, I want you to share, you know, from your heart, the things that you really learned that are speaking to you today.
the first morning we woke up, our room overlooked the main street. There's really only one street in Bamiyan. And I watched the city wake up. I watched boys and men set up shop. I watched husbands carry stacks of naan home. I saw almost no women for the first couple of hours. I saw one, in the weeks I was there in the mornings, I saw one female student go by and one very young girl who was waiting for something. The other men would come out and gather water. Where are the women? Well, after a few hours, when everything was set up, the women would start to reach the streets in clusters. About a quarter to a third in burqas, the rest well covered up. I was always with Douglas or Larry when I went out, except when I ran across the street to check and see if we had internet available. And when I first got there, when I first started walking the streets, I felt so hopeful and impervious, and I just wished salam to everyone I met. And eventually, I felt this pressure on me, and I slowed down and just hunkered down and put my head down when I walked through the streets of Bamiyan. And I kind of noticed that in the women too. See, many women in Afghanistan will never even talk to their neighbors. They'll be in their half of the house and they'll go into the fields and they'll never talk to their neighbors unless their neighbors are family. So that's what I saw and experienced in Afghanistan. We visited families. We visited the families of the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers, but we would never see the women, except that at the end of the meals I would be taken to that half of the house, and they would put their hands on my face and they would hug me and they would take me into a room and feed me. Or they might, if I asked if I could help them, they might show me where their ovens are or where they're winnowing bread or grains, but they wouldn't really let me help, and I didn't know what I was doing. They might put a little basket in my hand and have me toss grain twice, and then they would take me to something else. And it was joyful, and I know that at the same time their lives were very limited. So the women have no power over what they do or where they go. That's what I got to see in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Jody. Douglas, I know that you went not only as a trained biosand water filter instructor, if you will, but you are a GIS specialist that helped out this Danish non-geo. Tell us about that particular experience?
Well, I inquired about their geographic information system prior to going and found out they were using older software, and they knew about the new software and wanted to be able to use it, so I was able to get the new version over to them, licensed properly for their use. And then I looked at their databases with them, and we discovered that there were some inherent conflicts of the data. Some of your viewers will know about projections and datums and the different ways that we look at the planet when we take it from a sphere and try and flatten it out. And so we stabilized their basic data so that it would all line up. Sometimes, Uzbekistan would show up right where it should be, and in other maps it would be somewhere else. And so we resolved some of those basic problems. But then they shared with me some of the water issues that they're mapping. And in 2 of the provinces, they have huge arsenic issues. In Ghazni province, for instance, where the levels of arsenic are so high, off the charts high, that the cognitive-related disabilities can be directly attributed to the presence of arsenic. And what they're hoping to do soon, and this is one of the reasons I'd like to go back, is to be able to better map the health issues and line that up with the water issues so that they can show others the problems that they face. In addition to the chemical difficulties and the biological ones that we've talked a little bit about, the access to the water is changing. In Kabul, in the city of Kabul, the water table has dropped over 20 meters in the last
20 meters.
In the last 2 decades. And in the last year, it dropped another meter.
That has tremendous impact for shallow wells.
Oh yeah, it's beyond our conception of it. What it does is it forces people to be drinking dirty surface water when they had relatively, cleaner subsurface water. Not all the subsurface water is clean either.
Now, you were with the folks in Dakar for 4 or 5 days before the 3 of you traveled on then?
Well, then I came back a few more days because of the rank and file technicians there were really thirsty to use the new software and to learn whatever they could and to receive some kind of certificate so that they could move on.
Now, while you were off doing the work, Larry and Jody got to do some things like at Rastegar Carpets. Tell us about that.
Rastegar Carpets, which we were told translates as the Righteous Brothers Carpets, which we found amusing. This is a group that had spun off of an NGO about 5 years ago. And what they do is they buy wool on the market, they bring it to their compound, they clean it, and they dye it using only natural dyes. And then they give the wool, that wool to weavers in their homes, and they have set up looms in various weavers' homes. These are mostly Hazars. And then these people were producing incredibly high quality carpets. They developed their own designs based on ancient Persian designs. And then they were marketing these carpets. And their plan is that within the next 2 years, the people who had a Southern Baptist background who had helped develop this are planning to pull out of the situation and turn the company over completely to the weavers, and it'll be their company to develop. So that was a incredibly hopeful situation. They were having the biggest problems they were having was transporting the finished carpets out of the country
to get their product out of the country.
Yeah. So that was a large.
Now, Jody, I know that you're very much aware of the various products that you have at Traditions Cafe, and there's in the shop there, Dick has a variety of products that come from around the world. Did you find anything in Afghanistan that might be able to shipped out of Afghanistan, if that were ever possible?
The carpets from Rastagar carpets are too expensive for traditions. We did bring some 18-inch doll clothes that those same Hazara, now internally displaced peoples are working on. It was not a shopping trip at all.
No.
It's not Hakim's interest in these shopping trips, but I did have a really exciting moment there. The community that we brought the water system to is called Paytal Lakman, and it's been being built over the last 20 years, but it's for internally displaced peoples. And they're given the most marginal land. So it's an incredibly steep hillside with nothing growing on it except for some thorny shrubs. And there's the switchbacks going up through the homes that have been built. They all get their water from the base of the cliff, the same stream that they wash their baby diapers in, and that is downstream from Bamiyan. We've heard that every single person in Paytal Lakman has intestinal issues. So at the end of our trip to Bamiyan, Douglas and Larry were going back for the final water system meeting. It was going to be all guys. I did not need to be there. I decided to do something else. And then when I'm leaving what I was doing, I went to see the Buddhas. And I'm leaving the Buddhas, and I promised Hakim I would get home by dark. And so I started to chug through the fields, and there's Norlai and Douglas in the potato fields looking for me. Because at that meeting, about 10 women showed up expecting to see me. And so we hopped in a cab and drove over to Paytal Lakman, and I was so grateful that it was at the bottom of this cliff. I didn't know if I had it in me to climb the cliff one more time. And I go in, and here are these 10 women, and they were hoping to sell me some goods that weren't going to work. But Hakim had nourished a dream in me. He'd nourished a dream of talking to some women about starting a tailoring business there. And so I got to talk to them about this dream. I got to tell them how courageous they had to be to have survived 30 years of war and refugee status and rebuilding. Many of them had carried their children out of Afghanistan with nothing. And here they were rebuilding again. That all of them had had training in... See, part of what's happened in Bamiyan is NGO after NGO has come in and given trainings. They'll pay women to come to these trainings for tailoring and for setting up a business. But there are hundreds of businesses in Bamiyan, and not a single woman works in one or runs one. The only time I'll see women in a business is when they're in their clusters or at the women's spa, where, of course, there's women to guide you there. And so I got to tell them they had the education, and they obviously had courage, that it would take great perseverance. So Hakim translated for me, and I know he embellished, because this is part of his dream too. Because Hakim and the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers are about empowering the people around them, the ordinary people of Afghanistan. And some of the men behind us looked a little concerned. And some of the women looked like it would be too hard. And a few of the women actually looked like they were reaching for this idea. And so Faiz is one of the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers. He's the one who found Paytal Lakman for us. And one of the reasons that Paytal Lakman was selected was because they have a council member who's really honest and forward-thinking. And so we're hopeful because Faiz is there, because they have that council member, because some of the younger women were reaching for a different life. So we also talked about a few of the crafts that happen in Bamiyan that perhaps they could make that we could ship out. And some of that is felted design work.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Larry, you journaled while you were there, and some of us got to read journals. Occasionally, both of you would also journal, but you were sort of the head journalist, if you will. And is that journal available now for people to see, and where would that be?
They can find it online by going to globaldaysoflistening.org. Look for projects, click on that, and the Afghan Diary will come up, and it should be available for quite some time. It basically was just our impressions on a day-to-day basis of various things that we saw, people we talked to, problems we saw. Just basically.
Well, one of the
different
problems
experiences.
I know that I want our listening and viewing audience to learn more about is these molds are made out of steel, and that's the most expensive thing.
Yes.
I know that Friendly Water for the World helped with some of the funding on this one, and they run about $500 or more, because it's one thing to get a local welder to get it, but then in your case they had to have the transportation to get that mold. And then what do you do afterwards with a mold? Who owns the mold? And you're working with multiple cultures there, and there was a jirga or something. Tell us about how you solved this problem. At least you think you solved it.
Actually, I think we ended up paying $900 for the mold, something in, and you're right. That's the most expensive part, because other than that, the filters themselves are sand and gravel and cement. So you're only talking a few dollars once you have the molds available. So we did the training, and then the question came up: who's going to control the molds? Ali Juma, who she was talking about, who is from the council there, said that he, even before the training was complete, he'd been hearing conflicting ideas from different people in the village as to how to deal with it, and it would be a big political issue. So we sat down with Hakeem and Nurulai and Ali Juma and had a discussion about different possibilities, and ended up deciding that, at least initially, the best way to deal was we gave the molds to the people of the province of Bamiyan in the care of the Council of Pintal Blakman, and the council could deal with it in several ways. What we initially hoped they might do would make it available for rent to an entrepreneur who wanted to develop a business out of creating these molds or these filters. If that didn't work, they would make them available on a need basis. And we were there right in the midst of harvest season, so it was difficult to see the full impact. And it'll probably be 3 or 4 months until we know for sure how effective it was. In addition to Faiz and Ali Juma, one of the doctors from the Bamiyan Provincial Health Ministry, it was interested in the project, and he'll also be keeping an eye on it for us.
Well, we're actually down to the last 2 minutes, and in the last 2 minutes, I want to give each person an opportunity to share their 30 seconds or so of what they really came away with. What speaks to them now? Douglas?
I think we need to find really good ways that the rest of the world can meet these people and sense their beauty and feel the relationship with Mohammed Jan, Faiz, Hakeem, Abdullah. There've got to be good ways that we can help other people sense this brotherly, sisterly relationship that they want to have with everyone.
Thank you, Douglas. Jody?
What I came away with was hope in a hopeless situation. Adult after adult we talked to said, there's no hope except I have children. There has to be hope. Or this is the only way I can do this work is if I make up that there's hope. But spending time with these youth, I think there is hope.
Thank you. Larry?
There's, we were there a month, so there's a lot that we could say, but one thing we didn't touch on was the question of U.S. military being there. And we learned more. We realized that our ideas about the situation were fairly simplistic, and it's a complex situation. A lot of the people there are concerned that if America pulls the troops out precipitously, the Taliban or some like-minded group will take over again, and they were so horrendous. The U.S. troops a lot of times were described as being the least bad of all the bad options. So people need to learn more about that.
Well, I want to thank you, Larry, Jody, and Douglas, for sharing with us. We have a viewing audience that not only reflects Veterans for Peace, but Friendly Water for the World, Fellowship of Reconciliation, Global Days of Listening, Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers. We truly are an international community here in Olympia, and you've had the opportunity to reach out and be our answer to 9/11. Thank you.
Thank you.